Shalom, I'm Tony Robinson of Restoration Torah Ministries, and again, welcome to another episode of Resurrection in the Tanakh, where our primary goal is to show that the idea of resurrection on day 3 did not originate in the New Testament, but that it clearly has its foundation in the Tanakh, specifically in the Torah, and then the rest of the prophets and the writings. Again, as I said, as we begin to study the scriptures thematically, and we begin to make these thematic connections by comparing scriptures that have similar words, phrases, themes, ideas, events, circumstances, and situations, that as we begin to compare and contrast these scriptures, we will begin to see that with one voice, the scriptures will be shouting to us, teaching this idea. So last time we left off, we were talking about Genesis chapter 1, how the vegetation that sprang forth on day 3 was a picture of resurrection, where life sprang forth from where there was no life. And again, we said that happened on day 3. And so we're going to continue with our trek through the scriptures here. The first one that I want to look at today is Numbers chapter 17, verse 8. So let's do that. This is the story of how Aaron's rod budded. You remember that as a result of the rebellion of Korah and Datan and Aviram, children of Israel, they had a little problem with knowing who should be high priest, who was supposed to be the priest. And so Adonai had a leader from each tribe bring their staff, put it in the, I believe it was in the Ohel Moed, tent of meeting, I think. Didn't read that part. It's working by memory. And I think, Adonai said that he would choose which family would the priesthood would be. It says here in verse 5, Numbers 17, verse 5, and it shall be that the rod of the man whom I choose will blossom. Thus I will rid myself of the complaints of the children of Israel, which they make against you. Okay? Which they make against you. So that was the test. Adonai was going to put these rods, set them up, and then he was going to cause the rod to blossom. Okay, now, let's read in verse 8. Now it came to pass on the next day that Moses went into the tabernacle of witness, okay, the Ohel Moed, yeah, and behold, the rod of Aaron of the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds, had produced, blossomed, and yielded ripe almonds. Okay, so all of that happened. Okay, the rod of Aaron, it budded, it brought forth buds, bloomed blossoms, and yielded almonds. Okay, now there's a couple of things that I want to look at here. First of all, I want you to think about the fact that this scripture is I want you to look at the thematic connections that it has with some of the other scriptures that we talked about. So, for instance, remember we looked at the scripture in Job, I think it was 38 and 14. I think it was Job 14, where it talked about how you can cut a tree and yet there's still hope that it may live, okay? Think of this example here. What is a rod? What was that rod? The rod was a piece of wood, right? That piece of wood used to be or came from some type of tree at one point. And so in a real sense, when you think about a piece of wood is dead. It was something that was alive. Okay, it was alive at one point, and now it's dead. And so, just as Job 14 talked about, there's hope for a tree, even though it may be cut, for it to live again. Think about that in relationship to this rod that budded and actually brought forth fruit. And what I want to suggest to you again is that this miracle here, this miracle was the miracle of resurrection. Okay, it was the miracle of resurrection. It was the miracle of life springing forth from where there was death. You see, now on day 3 in the resurrection account. In the resurrection account, what we saw was a teaching of life springing forth from where there was no life, because nothing had died. There was just nothing alive. And so the point that I made last week was that in Genesis 1:11 through 13, when Adonai caused the vegetation to spring forth associated with day 3, in that instance, what we saw is that it was a picture, it was a shadowy image of resurrection in the sense that life sprang forth from where there had been no life. But now in this example here, in Numbers chapter 17, verse 8, we see a clear picture of full resurrection. There was death, okay, because whatever, that rod that Aaron brought forth, it came from a tree, and that tree had died long ago, and that piece of wood that he had was a dead piece of wood. But what happened? It sat in the Ohel Moed overnight, and Adonai caused life to spring forth from that dead piece of wood. And so clearly it is a picture of resurrection, okay? And again, we saw the thematic connections earlier on in the second teaching of how Adonai uses what? He uses vegetation to teach about resurrection in human beings, okay? And so this is all hinting at resurrection. So the other thing is I want you again, note how this passage is thematically connected to Genesis 1:11 through 13 in another sense. Because Genesis 1:11 through 13 talks about the fruit yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, right? And now what happened with Aaron's rod? Not only did it bud, not only did it bloom blossoms, but it also brought forth what? Fruit. Just like those trees did, it brought forth fruit just like the trees did in Genesis 1:11 through 13. Again, so see what we're doing is we're simply going through the scriptures, and we're using scriptures that are all thematically connected to each other in the sense of vegetation sprouting life, or vegetation that was dead then coming forth to life. Okay, we had Isaiah 40 verses 6 through 8. We had Isaiah 26:19. Job 38, Job 14. So we're looking at all these scriptures. They're all intimately thematically connected. They share common themes, okay? And as we begin to compare and contrast them, they're going to paint this beautiful picture, you see. And each one of these scriptures gives us a little different flavor, a little bit different aspect of the general teaching that Adonai is trying to bring forth, is that he uses vegetation to teach about death and resurrection. And so we're gaining understanding about death and resurrection by looking at vegetation. And we've already seen the connection between man and vegetation. So we can learn something about resurrection from the dead with humans when we look at it associated with vegetation. Number one, that it's possible. Number two, that it's going to have something to do with life-giving water. And from Genesis 1:11 through 13, we see our first instance of where it is associated with the number 3. Okay, so we're going to come back to that association with number 3 in some later teachings. But first thing I want to do is I want to talk to you about the 120 men of the Great Assembly, the 120 men of the Great Assembly. And these were the leaders of Israel in the Second Temple era. It was a panel of 120 prophets and sages, okay? These are 120 prophets and sages, including, let me give you some names that were included in the 120 men of the Great Assembly. Ezra, Nehemiah, Mordecai, Daniel, Simeon the righteous, and the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, okay? These are some of the people that participated at one point or another in this 120 men of the Great Assembly, and they constituted the ultimate religious authority in Israel at the onset of the Second Temple era. This would be the 4th century BCE, okay? The 120 men of the Great Assembly. Among their accomplishments were the composition of the standard text of the prayers and blessings known as the Shemona Esrei, or the Amidah prayer, the Amidah, which means standing, okay? So it's the Shemona Esrei, which means 18, because it was a series of 18 blessings and blessings/prayers, Shemona Esrei, but it also became known as the Amidah because excuse me, it was a prayer that was done standing, okay? So, observant Jewish people will pray this prayer standing. And again, the time frame is the 4th century BCE. But what they did is they penned these prayers. I'm not exactly sure if they finished them, but I know that they're the ones that formulated these prayers, these 18 blessings, which are being prayed to this day 3 times a day by observant Jewish people. Okay, now what I want to do though is I want to talk about the first 3 prayers. Now the first 3 prayers, they have names for the first 3 prayers or blessings, okay? And the first one is called patriarchs, and it has to do with Adonai being the shield of Abraham. I'm not going to go into that one. The third prayer has to do with God's holiness, okay? And it's the second prayer that we want to key in on. We want to look at the second prayer. We're going to look at its content, what is it talking about, and we're going to try to understand what was going through the minds of the 120 men of the Great Assembly, which, as I said, included prophets such as Haggai, Zechariah, and Ezra, Nehemiah, those guys, and Daniel. What was their worldview? Okay, and we can gain a glimpse of their worldview or how they thought just by simply reading their writings and really paying attention to what they were trying to say. So I want to look at this second prayer, and I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to kind of go through and talk about it. Now listen to what it says here. It says, you are eternally mighty, my Lord. The resuscitator of the dead are you, abundantly able to save. You make the wind to blow and the rain to descend. You sustain the living with kindness. You resuscitate the dead with abundant mercy. You support the fallen, heal the sick, release the confined, and maintain your faith to those who are asleep in the dust. Who is like you, O Master of mighty deeds, and who is comparable to you, O King, who causes death and restores life and makes salvation sprout? And you are faithful to resuscitate the dead. Blessed are you, Adonai, who resuscitates the dead. Okay. Now, what I want to do is I want to go through this. And now, as I read, do you see what the dominant theme of this prayer is? Okay, do you notice how many times it talks about resuscitating the dead? Okay, so in other words, this prayer literally mentions resuscitating the dead about 4 times here. At the beginning here, you are eternally mighty, my Lord, the resuscitator of the dead are you. Who is like you? It says you cause death and restore life. It talks about right here. Where is it again here? You are faithful to resuscitate the dead. Blessed are you, Adonai, who resuscitates the dead. I mean, clearly the dominant theme of this prayer is the resurrection from the dead. Okay, and this is a prayer of blessing upon Adonai, recognizing and acknowledging that he is the one who has the power to resurrect from the dead. Okay, so now let's think of something here. At one point here, it says, you cause death and you restore life. Now, what does it mean by restore life? Well, again, that is just another way of saying resurrection from the dead. You restore life. Now, it can mean, when you're on your sick bed and he heals you, in that sense, you're restoring life also. But I can also see how where it says you restore life, if we take that to its ultimate literal fulfillment, that would mean resurrection from the dead also. What does this phrase mean here, where it says that you maintain your faith to those asleep in the dust? When you maintain your faith to those asleep in the dust, well, what is that talking about? It's talking about the fact that Adonai is going to be faithful to resurrect from the dead those who have put their trust and their hope in him, okay? And so again, see, even in this prayer, the aspects which did not literally say resurrect from the dead or resuscitate from the dead, it's all about resurrection from the dead. How about this? What does this phrase mean here where of salvation sprouting? Okay, right here where it says, and who is like you, O King, who causes death and restores life, and listen to that phrase, and makes salvation sprout. What is he talking about there? Well, again, if we have studied the scriptures correctly, and if we made the proper thematic connections, what we understand is that we will understand that Adonai uses what to teach us about death and resurrection? He uses vegetation, right? And that's been the whole point of this first series of lectures or teachings here, is to show you that Adonai uses vegetation to teach about the resurrection of the dead in human beings. Now, look at this is a clear, when it says make salvation sprout, this is a clear reference to resurrection in human beings as taught by the blossoming of life from dead vegetation, dead vegetation, just like in Isaiah 26:19 that we saw earlier. So remember, one of the first scriptures that I talked about was Isaiah 26:19, and we made the connection in that verse between the literal bodily resurrection of people from the dead and the sprouting forth of vegetation from the earth. Remember we made that connection? Well, look, in the second prayer of the Amidah, or the Shemona Esra, the writers of this prayer, which included prophets such as Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi, and other folks, they have clearly made the connection, because when they say who makes salvation sprout, okay, sprout, if you're talking about something sprouting, what are you talking about? You're talking about vegetation coming forth to life. And so from our previous discussion, it is apparent, it is like so abundantly apparent that the 120 men of the Great Assembly, that they saw the connection between vegetative growth and decline of that vegetative growth with resurrection from the dead and death, respectively, okay? Thus, makes salvation sprout is a clear reference to resurrection, okay? Yes, sprouting vegetation. When you see vegetation sprout, that is a clear metaphor or simile for resurrection from the dead in a literal sense for human beings. And so again, what I said that we were going to do is we're going to look at this prayer, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to gain insight into how some of the prophets, right? We want to gain insight into how they thought about resurrection from the dead. We want to gain insight. What was Daniel's kind of worldview? What was Zechariah and Malachi and Haggai? What was their worldview? Ezra, Nehemiah, what was their worldview? What was the paradigm that they used for the resurrection of the dead? And clearly what we see here in this second blessing of the Amidah is that the worldview or the paradigm that they were working from is that when they could see restoration of vegetation, just as the scripture says, that it's actually a picture of resurrection from the dead. And so this second prayer, which is clearly about resurrection of the dead. I mean, there's no one who could even argue this point that this scripture is not about resurrection from the dead, even though in many in Judaism, in Jewish synagogues, you have Reform Judaism, which is basically a liberal, very liberal form of Judaism, where basically they really don't believe anything. I mean, they just don't believe anything. And so I've read this prayer and how it's been basically butchered in some Reform Judaism synagogues to not say resurrects from the dead, but what did it say? It says that it's just something, something very sterile and benign, like who gives life or something. Basically, what they did is they mutilated this prayer. So that it did not say what it says, which is that Adonai is the one who will resurrect from the dead. Because of their unbelief, what they did is they substituted, well, he's the one that gives life or something like that, right? Okay, now that's not done in most of Judaism, especially not in Orthodox and conservative circles, but in some of the more liberal Reform Jewish congregations. because of the total lack of faith in the resurrection and Adonai's power to resurrect from the dead, they kind of dilute this portion. They dilute this so that it doesn't mean exactly what it says. But again, as we go forth, what we're going to see is that clearly Adonai is using vegetative growth. So we have basically up until this point, what we've done is we've laid a foundation. We've laid a foundation for where we're going to go in this teaching. We've seen that Adonai, how he uses this vegetation, equates it with man in order to teach us about death, burial, and resurrection. And so, and we can gain insight from that. We've also saw the first, what I call prophecy. I believe that Genesis 1, 11 through 13 is actually the first messianic prophecy of how the Messiah would resurrect on day 3. And again, there's a few blanks we have to fill in there. But again, the idea of this teaching is not specifically to teach that how the Torah teaches that Yeshua needed to resurrect in 3 days and 3 nights. We have another teaching for that. But this is to establish the fact of resurrection on day 3. So as we go forward, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take different categories of scriptures. We're going to go through different categories. So, for instance, what we're going to do is we're going to look at stories of literal death and resurrection. Okay, we're going to look at them. We're going to compare them and contrast them, because obviously, every story of literal death and resurrection, is going to form a thematic unit. They're all going to be thematically connected to each other because of literal death and resurrection. We're going to look at how the scriptures teach about death, resurrection, and the number 3. In other words, the scripture quite often is going to talk about resurrection, it's going to talk about death, and it's always going to have that number 3 associated with it. Not always, but very often. We're going to look at the phrase, the third day. We're just going to look at how that phrase is used in Scripture, and we're going to see quite conclusively that many times that phrase, the third day, has to do with resurrection. We're going to see at hints of resurrection in life. We're going to see that they're all associated with the number 3 and so forth. So we're going to look at many, many, many examples as we go forth through this teaching. Now, one of the things I want to state up front here is that Scripture uses numbers to teach things. Okay, Adonai is teaching through numbers. Numbers have significance in Scripture. Okay, it's not like in our Western Greek Roman world where numbers are just something analytical or just for counting and multiplying, et cetera, et cetera. In Scripture, numbers teach things. And so, for instance, when you think of the number 4, one of the things that you can always think about is judgment and or warfare. Okay, so for instance, it rained 40. It rained for the 40 days in Noah's flood. It rained for that period of time. The children of Israel, they were 40 years in the wilderness, right? Yeshua was tempted by the devil for 40 days, right? When Jacob was coming back to the land of Israel, it says that Esau was coming with 400 men. On my website, on restorationoftorah.org, on the YouTube website, I have an audio-visual presentation on the Torah portion called Vayishlach. Okay, the Torah portion, Vayishlach. I'm working by memory. I hope this is right. I'm pretty sure it is. Which is the Torah portion where Jacob and Esau meet for the first time after a couple of decades, right? After Jacob had fled to Padan Aram. So Jacob comes back. He has to face Esau, and Jacob sends a couple of messengers. He sends a couple of messengers ahead of him to kind of spy out the land, as it were. And that's well, I won't go there. Because that's literally what they were doing, and it has huge implications for what the children of Israel did later on. But he sent 2 messengers ahead, and they both went, surveyed the situation, kind of reconnoitered and everything, and came back, and they said, yeah, we saw Esau, and he's coming, and he's got 400 men with him. And from when he says he's got 400 men with him, Jacob knows what that means. Jacob knows what it means when those messengers say he's coming and he's got 400 men. Jacob moves in holy fear and terror for his life and the life of his family. And so he knew what it meant. But in that YouTube teaching, I spend probably half of the teaching going through the usage of the number 4, 40, 400, and 4,000 through Scripture. And what you're going to see, you see again, because if you study thematically, remember studying thematically means is that you compare and contrast Scriptures with similar words, phrases, ideas, situations, circumstances, and events. And so one of the easiest ways to study thematically is to just look at how a word is used over and over. And when you start looking at the number 4, 40, 400, 4,000, most of the stories that use that number have to deal with either judgment or warfare in some sense, okay? And so it's in this way that we study thematically. We look at the Scriptures with the common word, which is 4, 40, 400, 4,000, and then we just look and compare and contrast, and then we see, wow, almost every time we see this 4, 40, 400, or 4,000, it's about warfare. It's about judgment. And so, boom, there is the wisdom that Adonai wants to bring to you. So we're going to continue in the next series. We're going to start looking at this number 3 in the Tanakh, teaching resurrection.